we'll go ahead and get started. So I'm going to turn it over to Kip and Sandra really quick to welcome you all to today's presentation.
Thanks so much, Brenna. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sandra Miola. I'm the director of CDRW. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm so glad all of you can join us this afternoon. We thought it'd be great timing post the election for this particular topic, especially with a new set of priorities being set by a new administration in the White House. And also the information you'll learn today is not just applicable on the federal level, but also state and local as well, as you'll hear from Brenna shortly. This webinar also dovetails quite nicely since the Choose Clean Water Coalition's virtual Hill Week is scheduled in a couple weeks, the first week of March, and CDRW's virtual Hill Week is scheduled for the week of March 8th. So in pre-COVID times, we've typically hosted an annual Hill Day in Washington each March to educate members of Congress about the network's priorities and urge robust funding for programs and agencies that are vital to protecting our watershed's resources. Alas, this year, due to the pandemic, we were pleased to adapt and host a virtual Hill Week. This event is instrumental to building relationships with congressional offices and moving our priorities forward. We hope to see some of you there. Registration for Hill Week is open until Monday, and I can put the link in the chat in a little bit. No experience is necessary. We provide the training. With that, I will turn it back over to Brenna.
Thanks, Sandra. And just so that you know, the chat room is being monitored by Kip, so feel free at any part of this presentation to put your questions in the chat box. And I will be pausing periodically to answer those questions as well. So let's talk about what we want to get out of today. I want to make it clear up front in case it was not clear in the description that we are not going to be focused on messaging around your meetings for the fly-ins that are upcoming for both Choose Clean Water and Coalition for the Delaware River Watershed. Peter Marks, who's the federal affairs person, will be taking care of all of that and get you situated for the fly-in. So that's not necessary. That's not what this presentation is about. So I just wanted to say that up front very quickly in case you were like, oh, that's what I thought I was participating in. I will not judge you if you decide that you want your hour back for something else. I do want to kind of emphasize what I am hoping you'll take into consideration that will help you to stay, which is things like hosting meetings, especially when you have been in a position or in politics for a long period of time. It's kind of automatic, right? You meet with elected officials or appointed officials. You don't think anything of it. And so I liken it to brushing your teeth during the day. It's like it's something that you do. So it is not often that we take the time to pause and reflect on what it was like that first time that we met with those elected officials or those appointed officials. And if we did, that might give us a greater appreciation for what our guests that we invite along to these meetings might be feeling during that time. And as the convener or facilitator of any type of event, especially for these types of meetings with elected officials or appointed officials, the responsibility for preparing your guests, making sure that they are comfortable, and making sure that you can minimize the types of reactions that they may have in their first time of meeting elected and appointed officials is one of your most important jobs. So how do you go about doing that will be what we dive into today. And keep in mind, this is applicable not just for fly-ins or meetings with elected and appointed officials. This can be incorporated, what you learn here today, into any type of meetings, hosting of events, fundraisers, rallies, press events. There are going to be tidbits out of here that you pull that can be applicable across the board. So let's I wanted to start with a poll, which I will put here on your screen. And I asked the questions very similarly in the reminder email that I sent your way, which is, what type of physical reactions are you most likely to experience when participating in a professional meeting, conference, event, what have you, for the first time? And you can select multiple answers. And you might be asking, while you're filling this out, why am I asking this? Well, in all likelihood, if you think back to the first time that you ever did something in a professional arena, you experienced some type of physical reaction. I know for me, I get a nervous laughter, I tend to talk too much, and I fidget. I move around a lot. And so even right now, as I'm giving this presentation, I'm kind of wringing my hands a little, not that hopefully you can see that on camera. But there are physical types of reactions that come up. That is true for folks that you might be inviting into a meeting or attending an event for the first time. So I wanted to ground us and start today's presentation with this grounding moment. I'm sharing the results from the poll. So it looks like I am not in the minority when it comes to having a physical reaction of sweaty palms, fast heart rate, the fidgeting, staying quiet and observe. That's really interesting. The nervous laughter, chatter, and the folks that said that they were cool as a cucumber, bless you. And maybe you can share some of why you're cool as a cucumber in the chat box. For those of us that are not so cool as a cucumber, what do you think comes from that? How do you derive that skill? So again, wanted to kind of ground us in that so that you keep in mind during this presentation how your guests may be feeling as you are preparing for a meeting, in the hopes that that gives you a greater appreciation for what they're feeling, as well as how you can potentially offset some of those physical reactions. And just in case you were wondering, I did not forget introductions. I just find that you guys are going to be probably, the participants are the most enthusiastic and able to pay attention for the first couple of minutes of the presentation before email creeps in, social media, dogs start barking at the postman, kids come in for virtual learning. So I wanted to make sure that I covered some of the most important things first, which were the session goals, and then also ground you in that exercise. But introductions. So good afternoon. My name is Brenna Goggin. I am the Mid-Atlantic Leadership Development Manager for River Network. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am on the historic lands of the Lenape and Nanticoke. So in the chat box, I would love it if you would take a moment to introduce yourselves using the information that is on the slide. And I'll give you a minute to do that before we move on. Hi, Kelly, welcome.
Hey, Brenna.
So I'm going to keep going as you're introducing yourselves. Thanks, Sandra, in the chat box. And if you don't know whose lands you might be on, feel free. There is a website here, the nativeland.ca, that can be helpful in helping you find out whose lands you might be on. So like any meeting, regardless of what the context might be, there should always be a conversation between you and your team. And I'm going to assume for the purposes of today's conversation that you're not going through this alone. You're going to have a team of some type where you're asking questions. And the first, I'm hoping, question is, what is this meeting's purpose? Because the purpose helps you to define everything else from there on out. And I like to think of the purpose from a kind of similar to a SMART goals perspective. So if you've heard that acronym before, SMART being specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely. So if you're looking at this event and you're looking at your purpose and you've defined it, being as specific as you possibly can be about what type of gathering this is going to be, what type of purpose you want it to serve, how will it stand out, be unique from other events that your organization puts together, what sets it apart. Are you setting too broad or unrealistic, too broad of a purpose so that you're trying to incorporate as many things as possible into an event? Are you setting unrealistic expectations in defining the purpose? And is it relevant? Hill Day is done by the coalitions at a certain period of time of the year because it lines up with the appropriations process. So it's very relevant and timely that the Hill Days line up with when the president submits his budget and Congress is going through reviewing it, and we're making the financial asks as organizations to support watershed funding and other types of environmental funding throughout. So same goes with your Hill Day or fly-in or just council meeting. Is it timely? Is there a bill that you're specifically looking at? Is it because you're new in your position and you want an opportunity to introduce yourself? Is it because you want to talk about the work that you're having and the impact that it's having on their constituents, and you want to bring in the constituents, you want to move constituents up the ladder of engagement, what have you, looking at that purpose. And then thinking through who helps you to get there. So that'll help you to figure out your guest list. What type of event is most appropriate to fulfill this purpose? So sometimes having one-on-one meetings is most appropriate. Sometimes having a rally or a protest is more appropriate. Sometimes it's a press event. Really defining your purpose will help you to define what type of event that you should have. And again, what type of timing does it take? And here I would encourage you, especially when it comes to elected and appointed officials, to take into account that it's about impact and not necessarily about numbers. The only caveat to that, and I'll get to that in a bit, is when you're doing a press event or a protest. The numbers really are what's going to tell your story on a media source or what you can then go back to legislators. But for most events, it's really, I want you to focus on the impact that your meeting is going to have, both on your constituents and your elected officials, more than the number of people that you're able to get to show up. Another important caveat that I noticed before I was in my position here at River Network, I worked for a state organization doing lobbying work, and I would notice over and over and over again that special interest groups would bring down, of all varieties, hundreds of people, and they would be in their shirts, and I was guilty of this, be in their shirts, meeting with elected officials. The problem is that there wasn't a bill or any type of action for the legislator to take. And if you're going to bring down that number of people and you want them to have a lasting, impactful experience, then providing the legislator or whoever you're targeting the opportunity to take action will only bolster that experience. So if you're just taking people down for the sake of taking people down, then you might want to think about doing it in a staggered format, or looking at different ways that you can have elected officials come to your programs or your events as opposed to going to them. And I'm talking as if we are doing in-person events. This, again, applicable to virtual or in-person. I am putting out into the universe that one day soon, hopefully, we will be able to do in-person business again. But the same kind of concept goes if you're doing a virtual event. And in some ways, even more important because the numbers are going to be fewer. It can be a little bit trickier getting people out of the waiting room and into the presentation and what have you. So whether you want to do this in the chat or if you want to come off of mute and put on your video, I would really like you to take an opportunity to think back through the email that I sent yesterday, as well as the poll that we took earlier about the physical types of reactions that you experience when you're doing something for the first time professionally. And what advice, if you sought out advice from a colleague, a friend, a family member, what advice did they give you that you would take and share with others? Just be yourself and relax. Be prepared and know your role with the team. And just out of curiosity, Daniel, like when someone said just be yourself and relax, how did that make you feel? Did you feel like that was helpful, or did you feel like, well, I'm always myself and relaxing, like when I'm already nervous, like that just makes me more nervous?
It to me, it almost sounds like an oxymoron, because sometimes I'm relaxed and sometimes I'm freaking out at the same time. But I'm a very lively person, so I sometimes I take it as a compliment. So just chill and relax is it's just me.
Yeah, thank you. Kip saying I don't know, but we'll find out and follow up with you. Yes, much better than guessing. Carol will be able to educate the representative about the issue you're asking for their help on. So great, thank you. So I hope as you're putting in your advice that you've received and you're thinking about how helpful or not that was, I want you to think about that as, again, you're preparing your guests. So if they come to you and they say, I'm really nervous about this, or you can just read the room virtually or in person that things are a little bit off, this will give you an opportunity to check in, perhaps give some advice, and you want to give advice that you have found helpful, right? So maybe not the same advice that you're like, that wasn't helpful to me at all. Maybe not repeat that. So that's why I'm asking this question and having you to reflect on it. Plus, I always find that people have been given different advice and received different advice. So sharing it amongst us is an opportunity for us to hear what others have been given and whether or not they find that helpful, can copy and paste it and keep it in their back pocket for when they're leading a meeting. So step one of preparing for any type of meeting, gathering, fly-in, what have you, is building your guest list. The who is often tied to the what. So remember, the what's the purpose. So who is going to help you to fulfill that purpose? When hosting or meeting with elected officials, your guests should reflect the purpose of the meeting. Well, let's review the reasons why you would be meeting with elected officials to begin with. So I have increased funding, which really fills in with the fly-in and appropriations process that you all are going to experience here in a few weeks, raising an organizational profile, or building relationships. Depending on the purpose, will also determine your guest list. So if you're looking at increased funding, having individuals or organizations that were directly impacted, either positively or negatively, meaning that they weren't eligible or the funding didn't encompass their work, would be really helpful to have in that meeting so that an elected official can hear what was helpful, what was not helpful, and that can be replicated. Individuals or organizations that can speak directly to the financial, environmental, or social justice issue of a decision. So if you don't provide the funding, what's going to happen? If you do provide the funding, what is likely to happen? So that could be projects on the ground that you know can be implemented and what they could potentially do from an impact perspective or an offset perspective. And what happens if you don't? Are there organizations or individuals that will face some dire straits if a funding package is not passed? If you're looking at building relationships with elected and appointed officials specifically for the organization, then it would be much more appropriate to invite people that are part of your organization. And in this regard, looking more internal. So who are your staff? Inviting some key staff that work at different areas of the organization and can speak to some of the projects and programs that you lead. Some key board members that have had a lasting impact on the organization or have put their kids through programming or have protected land through your organization. key donors and volunteers that are really active in the organization and can speak to your why. Why is it so important to support the organization? If you're looking to raise the organization's profile, think about expanding that same list out a little bit more and include program participants. This is where it can be helpful to bring in, if you're an education-based organization, bring in some students that have benefited or are currently benefiting from your program, or counselors or parents if the children are unavailable. You could have that mixture there. Again, this is a part of moving away from the numbers. It's not about how many people you have sitting around that table. It's about the impact that you're leaving on those people that are attending, as well as the elected and appointed officials. It's about the stories that you're telling and the results that come from those stories and experiences. Again, press events, rallies, protests, very different scenario. Oftentimes the impact is wrapped up in the numbers. There is a lot to be said when you see people out on the mall, legislative mall, or out in front of a Capitol building with all of the same t-shirts with their signs, and that's really great on news coverage, and it does help to raise the profile. It does help to bring numbers back to legislators and appointed officials. So that one is always one that's by itself, where perhaps the numbers are more important than the impact, but I wouldn't lose sight of the impact just for the numbers. So preparing the staff, what do I mean by that? There are two sets of guests at your meeting when you meet with elected officials or appointed officials. Often, those elected or appointed officials have staff. They are also considered part of your guests, even though they work for the person that you're trying to meet with. More often than not, the elected or appointed official themselves may have to step out, will miss parts of the meeting, all of the meeting, and the staff is who you're going to get. So making sure that you prepare them ahead of time by providing who's going to be in the meeting, what are their names, where are they from, maybe some context to why it is that they're attending the meeting, what stories they may be telling. And if you specifically want 2 or 3 people to share their story, outlining that to the staff ahead of time will help the staff prepare the elected and appointed official to block out that time or make sure they're present for that moment, or they're not trying to rush through. Making sure that you talk to the staff ahead of time so that they understand how much time you're looking to have so they can block their calendars and, when appropriate, the elected and appointed officials' calendars appropriately. Will the staffers be hosting the Zoom meeting? So in virtual format, whose Zoom account is something that we have to now take into account? Are we using? Because that also determines a lot of different things, but most importantly, how you're going to communicate with your guests and the staff here on out. You don't want to be posting private chats with your guests using a legislator's Zoom account. Why? Because oftentimes the account holder, like yours truly for today's webinar, gets a report that has the meeting chat information. So following this webinar, I'll get all of your introductions, the advice that you've been given, what have you, in its own file document. Are the staff going to do the introduction or not? It's always a little awkward, and even more so now on virtual platforms when you're starting to get started. Who's speaking first and who's going to be making the introductions? When is it most appropriate for the elected official to go first? I've been in lots of meetings where elected officials are like, no, I'm here to listen. Like, I don't want to do the introductions. And I've been in others where they want 20 minutes to explain all of the ways they've addressed my issues before we even get to really what my issues are. So having that conversation with the staff ahead of time and preparing that can be hugely helpful in preparing your guests who may not have as clear of an idea of what they're walking into. So your guests and your meeting prep, what all does this look like? If you've ever attended a meeting with an elected official, whether it be at their office or over Zoom or at an event, you already know that it can be chaotic. They're looking at their phone, they're being pulled out by their staff, they're having to run to get a vote. The only time they say that they have 15 minutes, but really the only time they have are from the time you're walking from the office to the floor, or worse, to the bathroom. We get it for folks that have been in this world for a long time. Your guests may not. If this is the first time or even second or third time that they are experiencing this type of meeting, they may take it personally if elected or appointed official or the staff have to walk out halfway through their story, not realizing that in all likelihood that is going to happen. So making sure that that's clear to them up front so that they understand what to be prepared for. Also, whether or not the elected official is going to attend or not. I hosted many a fly-in my day. We would be told that a congressman or congresswoman would be on staff and ready to meet with us, and then a vote came up that they had no control over. And so unfortunately, I would have to then break the news that no, we're not meeting with legislators. And then other times we were told they weren't going to, and then they showed up and it was a beautiful surprise. So underlining that we just don't know, and it's going to be chaotic, can be really important. In a virtual format, this type of prep work is even more important, mostly because you're looking at legislators popping in and out of the screen, or worse, they're not putting their video on, but they're kind of creeping on the meeting. So you'd have to have the participant list open to know that they've joined the meeting. So preparing your guests for what that looks like and how to tell their stories, whether or not you're, again, using the legislator's Zoom account, the staffer's Zoom account, or your own, and how you will be checking in with your guests throughout the day. Making sure that you have that platform set up. So if the legislator says, I want to use my account because I want to be able to record the meeting and reflect back on it later, what is your plan then to allow for your guests to communicate with one another and you to communicate with them that's not on that Zoom platform? Are you going to use Slack? Are you going to be using text messaging? How is the day going to go? Setting up an agenda. So 9 a.m. introductions, 9:10 we're meeting with this elected officials. Here's who's going to speak. Here's what stories they're going to be telling. And here's what materials are going to be sent following the meeting and who's sending them. One of the most important opportunities to move people up the ladder of engagement is by preparing them for these types of meetings. Because if you leave them feeling like they were prepared and they were able to participate and they made a difference, they're going to be much more likely to attend any event that you host in the future, donate to your cause, become a Gold Star volunteer. If they come into this situation where they had no idea like what to expect, they had no idea what to wear, both for virtual and in person, wearing clothes and types of clothes, still very important, having, all that. And they walk away feeling frustrated, confused, they took personally the elected official or staff leaving, then in all likelihood, they're going to be very reluctant to be helpful to your organization or you moving forward in your cause. So that's why this why is so important. How will the guests follow up? In an ideal world, you don't want this to be the only time that your guests are interacting with elected officials. How do you set them up to continue building the relationships and stay engaged in your organization and in the issue that you're talking to the elected official about? How do you encourage them to become more involved in the process? Not just working with your organization, but with others, going down to Legislative Hall or the Capitals on a regular basis, listening to hearings through Zoom, what have you. And then the material follow-up. Typically, we all, when we were able to meet in person, we'd all have our little folders with all of our organizational information, and we would leave them along with the appropriation request letters in the staffers' hands, and they would have a big pile and they'd walk away. Who's doing that now? Who's going to be the point person? How are you going to provide opportunities for your guests to interact with them moving forward? And then basic things. How long is this meeting going to last? Who's likely going to have an opportunity to talk? And oh, by the way, you should always have a plan B or a plan C, because no matter how much preparation you do with the staff and your guests ahead of time, in all likelihood, things are going to come up. So how do you plan for that eventuality? When we are in person, there are things that you have to think about. Again, attire, transportation, how are you getting to the Capitol or your meeting? How are you ensuring that people are fed and happy? Because hangry people and guests and staff are not fun to be around. So avoiding that when at all possible. Same goes for virtual too. Like, are you scheduling the day so that folks are stuck in front of a camera for 5 hours at a time with very little breaks? Zoom fatigue is real and people do have to eat. So building in those break times to ensure that people have that opportunity, most important. So I wanted to pause here for questions in case anybody had questions about any of the content that we've gone over so far, or questions about preparing guests or staffers. Feel free to either put that in the chat box or come off of mute and on the video, and I just want to provide that opportunity. Yeah, Kelly, thank you. The Zoom private chat. And also, like, I even made a gaffe just during this presentation. I had the Hamilton soundtrack on, and I was messaging people in the waiting room that could not hear the Hamilton track, talking about how great it was, and like, who doesn't want to take a shot? And Kip was gracious enough to go, you're communicating with the waiting room, not the people that are actually in the Zoom room. So when we are trying to multitask, gaffes will be made. So having that third party opportunity is so important. Any other questions or reflections that people would like to share? Okay, well, think about it still. We have plenty of time. So your day is here. And in a couple of weeks, for those that are participating in the fly-in, it definitely will be here. So again, how are you going to check in with your guests? Have you built in that time into the day? So checking in often. So before the meeting, having people join the Zoom, if you've lined it up so that it's your Zoom account, having your guests come about 7 to 10 minutes prior. I always say 15 because invariably there's always gonna be the one, at least the one that's creeping in like 5 minutes before the presentation begins. So I like to build myself a little buffer of a window so that you have a chance to go over, okay, we already went over this already in another separate meeting, but let's just review really quickly. What's today's agenda? What do we want to get out of this meeting? Have a separate chat space so that people can communicate with you. And typically, like if we were in person, people could send you body signals or body language signals with their eyes or what have you that you might have been able to figure out ahead of time in Zoom. One of the good news about being in a virtual platform is there are plenty of third-party apps and opportunities for you to connect with people to make sure that they're doing okay, for them to be able to ask questions, especially if elected and appointed officials start using acronyms and people are like, I don't know what BMP means. And so they've already checked out of the conversation because they're not able to follow along. Are you providing those breaks? Are you providing opportunities for feedback? So this is also something that I learned over my years of taking people to meetings, is I was so focused on scheduling the meetings, getting people there, and then exhausted by the time the meeting was over, that I never really took the opportunity to go, so how was that? How are things? It's easier, for instance, on congressional fly-in days, if you're taking the train down to DC as a whole group. You have that train ride before the meeting to prepare, and then after the meeting to go, oh, are we so glad that that's over? And share those experiences. We have to be more intentional about that on a virtual platform, especially as people that are in leadership positions facilitating these meetings. Just like with any other event that you might be planning, you're probably going to feel exhausted. You're probably going to just want to curl up on the couch with your favorite Netflix binge-worthy TV show or book and just say, yeah, I did my job, I'm done. But your guests are going to need something more than that. And that's really what's going to set your meeting apart from any other meetings going forward. And encourage the feedback. Don't just say, like, so we good? Really ask questions that are meant to go, hey, did you, what questions might you have had from that presentation? How did whatever so-and-so said make you feel? Did that make sense, or did you have some more questions that you needed to ask? So encouraging people to provide feedback during the day, and then providing opportunities a couple of days, even to a week out, because we know how we feel with anxiety and so the excitement and the adrenaline that first time, but having time to actually sit and reflect, oftentimes we'll have questions that'll come up. Making sure again that you schedule breaks. And Peter is always notorious, if you're doing a fly-in, for him to have the happy hour after all of our congressional meetings. Again, if we're not in person, how do you build in that time? It's not just a time for the feedback, but it's a time to build a sense of community. Hopefully you've done that leading up to the meeting with elected and appointed officials by having these prep meetings in advance and allowing people to introduce themselves and get to know each other and share their stories before they share them with elected and appointed officials. But how do you get them to share the experience, the feelings that they have experienced throughout the day, the information that they have gathered, and build that sense of community past your event? So, and that's really about asking people, quite frankly, how does this work for you? What is the best way that we can schedule this? And it really depends on the schedule of the day. If you're doing 6 straight hours of meetings, then scheduling a late night happy hour is probably not going to go over so well. So thinking about your day and how you can incorporate that, whether it's 10 minutes, no cameras, but we're all going to share a meal together and we're just going to talk. That way people get a break from the screen. They can be encouraged to go for a walk and just put you on earphones. Let's go a little old school there. We're a big fan at River Network of making meetings now phone-based while we're walking to give our eyes and our minds a little bit of a break from the video. So just asking your guests what they might prefer could provide you with fodder for that. Evaluation. This is where I personally, when I was leading meetings, again, I think I touched on this, I did a bad job. We had really great materials for the fly-in. The coalitions do their own evaluation for fly-ins to ask how the meetings went, if there was any information that you wanted to make sure that you shared. But when I would go it alone, I would just assume that everybody was having a great time and a great day. And if they had issues, they would tell me. That's not how that works. People need to be invited to provide that type of feedback. And again, I think this should be done twice. Once is immediately after your event has wrapped up. So while it's still very fresh, people are still feeling the feelings, they're still even in the situation or scenario that you put them in, whether it's on camera or that you're still in the Capitol if you're in person. And then a few weeks out. So once everyone has had that chance to sit on the couch with their favorite book or binge-worthy TV show, decompress, relax, go back and ask the similar questions of what worked? What would you have liked to have seen done differently? What questions did you start out with and how were they addressed? And if they weren't, what questions do you still have outstanding? Initial feedback is probably going to be the truest. It's going to be the stuff that people are feeling right in that very moment. But when they have time to reflect, it might look a little different and they might have more constructive feedback to offer you that you can then implement and incorporate into future meetings. Also, different ways of inviting people to provide feedback. So some people are not comfortable with providing feedback in an in-person, on-camera situation like we are right now. So providing opportunities through email, Google Forms, SurveyMonkey, whatever apparatus you want to choose can be helpful. And also, if you've done this with a team, other colleagues, staff, if they have relationships with key people that you've invited to these meetings, and ask them to have those conversations. Sometimes offering it one-on-one, where you're just doing a check-in follow-up, the walk with the phone or a video chat, or back in the days when we used to be able to share a coffee or a tea, that would be a great opportunity to get that feedback as well. So I want to pause here again to see if there are any questions, or if people have, in leading these types of meetings, have found a great piece of advice that they would like to share with the rest of the group. Please feel free to come off of camera and off of mute to share that, or share it in the chat box, whatever you're most comfortable with. Okay. So seeing none, I want to end kind of the presentation today similarly to how we started the presentation, which is to give you time for reflection and intention. If you wrote down questions as you were going into this meeting, things that you wanted to make sure that were covered today and haven't been covered, please feel free to include those in the chat box, come off of mute and ask your questions out loud, whatever you're most comfortable with. If there were specific reasons why you decided to attend today's webinar, and you want to share how this webinar met those expectations or met that purpose or did not, feel free to also share that information so that we can make sure we address it. We do have 15 minutes for Q&A if we need it. So I just want to provide that space. I also want to provide the space for you to write down, because we're more accountable to ourselves when it's written down and kept in front of us, of how you might incorporate anything that you picked up on from today's presentation into any event, meeting, whether it's an internal staff meeting or a team meeting, or and more external with the fly-ins or a legislative meeting, how you're going to incorporate some of this moving forward, whether you're planning a conference virtually or not, what that might look like. If you could just take a few minutes, and if you want to share that so that we can hold you accountable, because you do better when others hold you accountable, please feel free to do that as well. There's a comment in the chat that some organizations have generic feedback forms that folks can submit and they keep as part of the record. Yep, absolutely. Thanks, Daniel. I'm going to assume that the question that you're asking of having meetings with elected officials, but you've never asked for feedback, do you mean from the elected officials themselves, or do you mean from the people that you have taken into those meetings?
Both, actually.
So there's a number of ways to ask people. Again, the generic form, always like just setting up a generic, like how, right, on a scale of 1 to 10, how did you think today went? Is there additional feedback that you could provide to make it better? What questions do you have? With legislators or elected officials, I always find it depends on the type of relationship you have with those elected officials. The staff, I'm much more comfortable with asking, so how did you think that went? And usually in person or scheduling a post-meeting conversation, whether it's on conference call or telephone, would be super helpful in that regard, because you don't want to ask them in front of everybody else, because they're probably not going to give you the best answer. But I do think by approaching them genuinely and going, hey, like how did you think that went? Did the elected official get what they were hoping for out of it? Did they have any outstanding questions? I think they would really appreciate that, because you're keeping the door open for an additional relationship building and conversation.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you for asking the question. Frank is suggesting that you only say things that you want everybody else to hear. Yes, multitasking can go really badly. Yeah. Yes, I love Daniel's video screen. Any other questions about preparing staff, preparing guests, following up with elected officials? Sandra put in the advice, you can never say thank you too often. That is certainly true when it comes to elected and appointed officials. And I know Peter highlights this a lot in the presentations that he gives, but following up with a thank you. I was a big fan of doing handwritten thank you cards to legislators when I met with them, and had them meet with my staff, and I would point out or quote something that someone said in those thank you cards, so that it would bring back that memory for them and drop it off at their desk. And I kind of became known as the handwritten thank you note lady down in Legislative Hall. I did it for legislators, whether they were leaving or as they came into a new session, and as they met with elected officials or even did a vote. And they kept them, and it was impactful. And then I encouraged others to do that as well. So I know Kip is going to put a, and she just did, they just did, thank you, Kip. Put an evaluation link in the chat box. It can also be found on River Network's website. So if you did have questions that you wanted to privately message me, or if you want some guidance or a thinking partner on setting a purpose and figuring out who to invite and what that may look like, I'm happy to be of service. So you can email me directly. And this is just one of the first of several trainings that we will be doing across the coalition. So feel free. I know Sandra will be sending that information out as the trainings get closer to the timeline. But I really appreciate you all taking the time today. I hope wherever you may be, it is blue skies and sunny, and you are able to get out before whatever weather event you might be looking at on the forefront is coming your way. And I don't know that anyone actually knows what that might look like. So thank you all very much, and have a good day.
Thank you, Brenna. Thanks, everyone.